Chapter 27 of The Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 27. Won't you say goodbye? Every eye kept a sharp lookout as soon as the journey was recommenced, and a strong effort was made to place a few miles between the party and a spot evidently infested with the venomous reptiles, of whose power such a terrible example had been seen. Plenty of energy, too, was displayed for quite a couple of hours. Then it died out at once. Boys and animals seemed as if they could go no farther, and a halt was called in about the barest spot they had seen. Several more suitable places had been passed, places where there was a scanty growth of sagebrush, others where the plain was rocky or encumbered with stones. But the doctor's word was forward, and the order was obeyed, for in the eyes of the adventurers every bush and every stone appeared to be the haunt of a dangerous enemy. Where they halted at last, the plain all round was thick with a dull, silvery haze, which intensified the heat of the sun, whose rays seemed to be passing through a burning glass, and it was only in obedience to desperate efforts that the tent cloth was stretched for shelter and the animals watered and fed more sparingly than before. The provisions were spread out, but no one could eat. Every word and look was about the water and directed at the fast emptying keg that carried it, other vessels having long since been exhausted. "We must lie here till the sun goes down," said the doctor, almost solemnly, in spite of his effort to speak calmly. "It would be madness to persevere through this heat. Then we must make a brave effort to reach the mountains by morning." "And if we don't?" said Wilton. "Don't say if, sir," cried Griggs. "We must do it." "If there are any to reach," said Bourne to himself, but his words were heard. "If there are any!" cried the doctor hoarsely. "I tell you there are. We saw them distinctly, Griggs and I." "That's so, gentlemen," said the American. "Then you must have lost your way, doctor." "I have not if there is any truth in a compass. I laid down our course, and we have not deviated a bit. The sun and stars, too, have endorsed my calculations. Come, lie down and try to sleep. Afterwards we will serve out some more water, and walk all through the night. We must be nearly across now." There was no answer made to this, every one lying down to try and forget the agonies of the intense heat and thirst in the sleep which would not come. Chris and Ned were together, and lay so that they could look into each other's eyes despairingly, but neither spoke, closing their lids at last so as not to see, though with no expectation of obtaining the much needed restful forgetfulness. But it came, and when Chris opened his eyes again it was to see by the dull red glow that evening was close at hand. He raised himself upon his arm, and the faint sound he made was sufficient to rouse Ned, who also sat up and looked at him wonderingly, as if he did not quite understand where he was, till Chris bent towards him and whispered, "Come outside." Ned followed him without glancing at the speaker, and they stood together in the misty heat glow, to note with wonder that some one was moving about from pack to pack and pausing from time to time to pat the mules. The haze seemed to have thickened with the approaching night, so that the figure was indistinct and hard to see, but after making a few steps Chris said quickly, "Why, it's Griggs! What's the matter with him? He's staggering about as if looking for something." "The water barrels," whispered Ned hoarsely, and he caught Chris by the arm. "What? He wouldn't," said the boy angrily. "Let's see what he's doing." The American evidently heard their approach, for he turned to gaze at them strangely, but he made no effort to join them, standing slowly, rocking himself to and fro and saving himself from falling by clinging to the mule at whose side he stood. "What's the matter, Griggs?" said Chris hoarsely. "Oh, it's you," said the reply. "I could see you both coming, but you looked swollen up into giants, and I couldn't make it out." "But what are you doing here?" "Doing here? Yes, I remember. We must find where the water is to night, or it will be too late." "Oh, don't say that!" cried Ned in a hoarse whisper. "Yes, that's it," said Griggs strangely. "Must find the water to night, or it will be too late. I'm going to ride on, but I can't find the mustangs." "They're over yonder," said Ned quickly, pointing to where the ponies could be dimly seen. "No, I've been over there, and they're gone." "Going to ride on?" said Chris, as a thought struck him. "Yes, before it's too late." "But you are not in a fit state to ride on, Griggs." "No, everything is going round and round, heads all strange and queer. You couldn't sit a horse now." "No," said the man drowsily, as he laid his arms across the mule's back, falling forward to slide to the ground, for the mule took 2 or 3 steps to get out of his way. "Oh, Chris," groaned Ned, "what shall we do?" The boy addressed did not reply for some moments, and then he repeated the American's words as if to himself. The next minute he seemed full of energy, and caught his companion by the shoulder. "Ned," he said, "let's take the mule with the empty barrels and ride on to get water." "Where?" said Ned dismally. "Amongst the mountains." "Where are they?" "Over there," said Chris, pointing. "Where's over there?" "To the left of where the sun's going down. That's where we've been making for all the time." "Ride on?" "Yes, it will be quickest." "Come and ask father what he thinks." "No," said Chris. "It would be losing time." "We should never find it, and only die of thirst right away from the others." "We should find it. We must find it, and bring some back." "But the barrels, they're not empty yet." "They are," said Chris solemnly. "I stood by this afternoon and saw every drop drained out." "Oh," groaned Ned, "then it's all over now." "It isn't, I tell you. We must go." "We couldn't do it. We're too weak. Come and ask your father what he says." "It's of no use. I feel sure he's like poor Griggs here. There, the sun's going down, looking red as blood. Quick, the ponies can carry us, and we'll get the mule with the empty barrels between. He'll go then." "Let's ask Wilton to go." "Let's try and act like men," cried Chris passionately. "There, you mustn't oppose me. That's the way, straight there by where the sun is sinking. It must be right. You must, you shall come." One weaker than Chris was then would have been sufficient to overawe Ned in those terrible moments, and he yielded without another word. The 2 water barrels, with their linking chain, and the wooden, wood stuffed pack saddle lay ready, and the mule that had borne them suffered itself to be led to where it stood snuffling at the wooden vessels and passing its tongue about the bungholes till they were slung across its back, and then it stood quietly enough, as if instinctively grasping the object of this movement. As for the ponies, they raised their heads from where they were striving to get a little nourishment from some dust covered twigs, and whinnied their welcome to their masters when they were saddled and bridled. All was soon ready, when Chris raised his head to mark exactly where the sun had disappeared, a hard task, for the heat haze was thicker than ever. "Where's that star?" he said impatiently. "Which star?" "That one that goes down of a night 3 hours after the sun." The one my father used to guide us by in the early part of the night, and said that it was a planet." "I don't know. I never heard him say anything about it." "He did to me. There, high up. I can see it now, but it looks faint through this thick, dusty air, and it's higher up than I thought for." "It will be clearer and lower down by and by." "Are you going to steer by that?" "Yes, of course. Ready?" "No, we must go and tell our fathers what we are going to do." "No, we mustn't," said Chris stubbornly. "They'd only say we mustn't go, and after what Griggs said, I'm sure it's our only chance. We must get water and bring it back, if they're to be saved." "But are you sure of that? Mayn't they be better in the morning, and ready to go on?" "Not unless we get back with water. Now then, will you come?" "I daren't, Chris," said Ned with a groan. "It's too horrible." "Then you're afraid?" "How can I help it? See how dreadful it will be to strike right off into the desert all alone." "Not so horrible as to stop here and see the others die like that poisoned mule. Come." "I can't. It's cowardly to go and leave them." "It isn't," cried Chris. "It's brave, and we shall find the water and bring it back. Come, we're wasting time. Come on." "I dare not." "Very well," said Chris. "When father wakes in the morning, tell him what I've done and why." "What shall I say?" cried Ned hoarsely. "That I felt it was the only chance of saving all our lives, and if I don't come back it's because I couldn't find water, Ned." "And then?" "Good bye." "What do you mean by good bye?" "I don't know," said Chris sadly. "Only good bye." He held out his hand, but snatched it back and hurried beneath the spread out tent canvas, to drop upon his knees close to where the doctor lay plunged in a deep stupor more than sleep. Chris did not rest there many minutes before he sprang up again and walked hurriedly to where Ned stood with the two ponies and the mule. "Good bye," said Chris then. Ned made no reply, and giving his companion one long reproachful look, Chris placed his foot in the stirrup and sprang up into the saddle. "Won't you say good bye?" he cried. "No," was the reply, almost in a whisper, and with the darkness coming on fast now, Chris turned away his head and leaned to the farther side of his pony, to catch hold of the long hide rope attached to the mule's snaffle bit. Then, pressing the mustang's sides with his heels, the brave little beast stepped off boldly, the mule following close behind at the full length of the lariat, while the boy fixed the star with his eyes and made for it straight through the gathering gloom, which seemed to open out to receive him, and then closed in behind, so that after the first glance backward the boy made no other, for tent cloth, packs, saddles, and the horses and mules had been absorbed by the haze. If he had turned his head, though, ever so little, he would have been able to see Ned standing by his pony, but he felt that he could not do that for fear of the weak feeling which caused a strange swelling in his throat, increasing and causing a breakdown of the determination to which he had come. "I can't do it," he groaned, as he rode on at a walk, and then repeating the word "good bye" in a whisper, he bent forward a little, gave the hide lariat a jerk, and pressing his pony's sides, went off at an ambling trot, the mule following at once with two barrels rolling against the wood of the pack saddle, and with the chains making a peculiar hollow and jingling sound. "If it were not so hot," he muttered then, as he strove to think only of the object he had in view. "We ought to get over a long distance before daylight, for I feel as if I shall be able to do it, and the mountains may be near when the broad daylight comes." He was getting along at a fair pace now, gazing straight at the planet and listening to the rattle of the two barrels, when his pony uttered a sharp neigh, which was followed by a squeal from the mule, two challenges uttered by those whose hearing was keener than their masters, and responded to by another neigh from behind. In less than a minute, and before Chris had made up his mind which of the ponies was following, there was the beat of hoofs, and something shadowy closed in from the haze behind to come close alongside. "Who's that? You, Ned?" "Yes," came in a husky voice. "What do you want?" "You know. I can't let you go all alone." "What?" cried the boy, in a hoarse, cracked voice. "You don't mean—" "Yes, I do. You must be right." It was the speaker who held out a dimly seen hand now, one that was grasped and held while the ponies closed in so much together that the boys' legs touched as they cantered steadily on straight for a line drawn down in imagination from the planet now twinkling brightly, the guiding star which both boys mentally prayed might lead them to the object of their quest. Then, cantering steadily till the ponies dropped into a walk to avoid rough ground, the two lads rode on and on, with the barrels rolling behind, and the hours gently gliding by unheeded, till the glittering star sank lower and lower and dropped at last into the great bed of haze which seemed to extinguish it all at once, but not until Chris had marked down another to take its place as their goal. Neither spoke, for their heads were too full of the object they had in view, with its hopes and many fears. The ponies kept on straight for the starry guides, not deviating in the least from the point at which their heads had been directed by their riders, and the mule followed steadily behind, with the empty barrels keeping up their hollow, rumbling sound, and it was this that seemed to form a strange, lulling accompaniment to the boys' thoughts, which, in the course of their progress, gradually darkened into a confused, nightmare-like state. It was not sleep, but a stupor in which they kept on their horses instinctively, from no voluntary effort of their own. The state of exhaustion and weakness into which they had been lapsing during the perilous journey must have had much to do with their feelings, and robbed them of the power to feel more than a dull, numbing pain which came and went as their steeds ambled or walked unchecked or guided by rein, for even the lariat had glided from Chris's fingers and trailed along behind the mule upon the sand. Not that it mattered, for the mongrel beast kept steadily on behind its companions, trotting or cantering or dropping into a walk as they gave it the cue, but never once stopping to rest or attempting to browse. Always onward, straight onward, while the riders sank deeper and deeper into their strange, stupor-like state, which, in one faint struggle back into partial consciousness, Chris had likened to the closing in of the sultry haze, which seemed to him to press upon him as if it grew so thick that it held him fast what time he was being urged through it. Then utter unconsciousness of everything, which lasted without change, and as if the very calm, restful, painful end of all things had come. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 28. A Mule's Scent. Ned had much the same account to give as Chris of his sensations about the waking up on hearing a loud snorting and splashing, accompanied by the squealing of the mule and the rattling of the tubs and chain. Sleep or stupor, whichever it was, the boys had kept their seats during the night, and at early dawn, when Chris opened his eyes, half startled by the splashing, He saw what looked like a gray plain covered with dried up salt, stretching right away to a thick bank of what appeared to be clouds. Then, as he sat staring wonderingly, he saw that the salt plain seemed to be in motion, little waves passing away from where he sat. And then, as the truth gradually dawned upon his misty brain, he slipped off his pony to stand knee deep in water and begin to scoop up the soft, cool fluid and drink. He had swallowed several mouthfuls before his brain grew clearer, and then his first matter of fact, undreamlike thought was of Ned, and he cried aloud, "Water! Water!" The answer was a gurgling sound from somewhere to the right, and turning in that direction just as there was a tremendous splashing, he became aware of the fact, dimly seen in the gray dawn, that his companion was also standing knee deep and drinking. The ponies were calmly drawing in the refreshing fluid between their slightly parted lips, and the mule was wallowing and trying to roll over, every now and then sending its legs in the air, for them to come down again and raise quite a spray, for the effort to turn right over was a failure, the two barrels secured to the animal's back acting like buoys and keeping afloat. The next moment, regardless of his clothes, Chris dropped upon his knees, bent down till his lips were within touch of the water, and then he drank, so it seemed to him, as if he had never drunk before. Breathless after a while, he raised his head again. "Ned! Oh, isn't it glorious?" There was no reply, for his companion was now bending down and drinking with avidity. But at last he too raised his head at the same time that the mule ceased splashing, stood up in the water and gave itself a tremendous shake, before lowering its muzzle and drinking like the mustangs. "Ned!" cried Chris. "Why don't you say something?" "I can't," was the reply, and then, "I say, it's true, or only part of the long dream?" "True, true!" cried Chris. "But look sharp. Let's fill the barrels and get back to camp." "Ah!" ejaculated Ned in a long sigh. Fill the barrels. Get back. Yes, I'm beginning to be able to think now. My head felt all shut up, and as if it wouldn't go. We have found water, then?" "Yes, and we've been drinking. And what are you doing?" There was no answer, for Ned did not hear, from the simple fact that he had suddenly plunged his head right under water to hold it there for nearly a minute before raising it streaming. "Oh, Chris," he cried, "do that. It's lovely." His comrade wanted no more inciting to follow the example set, keeping his head below the surface in despite of the water thundering in his ears, till he was obliged to raise it and breathe. "If we only had time for a swim!" he cried, as he stood up panting once more. "Yes, let's have one." "No," said Chris. "The barrels. We must fill them and get back." "Yes, of course," cried Ned. "I can't think properly yet. My head's all muddly." "But how can we fill them? If we take them off, can we lift them on the mule's back again?" "Perhaps not," cried Chris. "But I know," he added after a pause. "Do you? Oh, my head's so muddly. Let's be quick and get back. I'm beginning to think now. Why, what wretches we are, drinking away here, and my father must be dying of thirst." "Yes, don't talk," cried Chris huskily. "Here, get to the other side of the mule, and take hold of the bit." Ned stared, but obeyed, and together they led the animal between them, wading farther into the lake, with the water gradually getting deeper, when, as it grew breast high, Ned burst out with, "Yes, the water seems to have melted something in my head, and I can think now. I say, are there any alligators here?" "I don't know," replied Chris. "Perhaps. Come on, you brute," he roared, for the mule began to jib and refused to go any farther in when from its own natural buoyancy and that of the barrels its legs refused to touch the bottom. Chris's fierce shout was accompanied by a heavy dig in the side from his knee, an act which Ned imitated with the result that the mule snorted, tossed up its head, and then lowered it, prior to kicking up its heels. But in performing the evolution of lowering its muzzle its mouth went down into the cool water, and the opposition ceased in the enjoyment of drawing in mouthfuls of the limpid element, while with all four legs separated to the utmost the animal now refused to move. "You brute!" roared Ned. But the mule was quite aware of that fact. It knew it was one of the most despised of brutes, and had been told so till it ceased to have any effect, while now that it was drinking, whip or spur, kick or blow would have had no effect. "Never mind," cried Chris. "I know, we can manage." As he spoke he rapidly opened the tompion like cover of one bunghole, letting it rattle down by the side of the empty barrel and hang by its little brass chain, and then dragged at the barrel, trying vainly to bring the opening down to a level with the water. "Oh, do something, Ned!" shouted Chris. "We ought to be on the way back. Shove your barrel up as high as you can." Ned thrust his shoulder under the side and forced the barrel up, and the wooden pack saddle gave a little at the same time. "That do?" he cried. "Yes, splendid!" For by pressing down with all his force Chris got the opening level at last with the water, which began to stream in till its weight rendered the task less difficult, and by degrees the barrel kept its own position, the air within going out in strange hollow sounds as it was dislodged. "Now I'm more than half full, Ned," cried Chris eagerly. "I'll hoist up my side while you draw your barrel down." This task proved more difficult, but after a few tries a little water rushed into the empty receptacle. Then a little more and a little more, till Chris thrust upward with all his might, and the clear fluid ran in with a rush, till the mule raised its head, shook the drops from its muzzle, and whinnied. Then, feeling far less buoyant from what it had drunk and the way in which the light barrels began to be turned into weights which kept it steady, there was no more resistance to being led in deeper, so that with very little effort the casks were lowered in turn till the water ceased to flow in, and the tompions were replaced and safely secured. The water was now, at every movement made, passing in little waves right over the mule's spine, and there it stood showing its teeth as if preparing to bite, but made no vicious effort, only stood blinking its eyes and turning its ears in all directions as if in the height of enjoyment. As soon as the second barrel was secured, full to the bung, the mule's head was turned. "Go on!" shouted Chris, and it slowly walked out of the shallowing water till it stood dripping on the sandy marge. "Now," cried Chris, "I'm going to lead my mustang in as far as I can wade, so as to get regularly soaked, and it will freshen the beasts too." "Yes, capital. Shall we take off the saddles?" "No, we won't stop." The ponies were led in till only their necks were out of the water, and then turned toward the shore. But they stopped twice to drink, and were approaching the spot where the mules stood, when Chris uttered a cry and caught at his saddle to save himself, his pony at the same moment making a plunge and snorting violently. "What's the matter?" cried Ned anxiously. "Some big fish struck at me suddenly. No, I know, it must have been a big alligator." Ned's jaw dropped and his eyes opened very wide as he began to splash through the water as hard as he could go, the pony following, willingly enough, but only to snort and plunge as a swell of water rose before them where the water was very shallow, and a dark bark like glistening back was seen for a moment, followed by a tapering tail as a reptile glided by. "I wonder whether the brutes would bite," said Ned. "I shouldn't like to trust them," was the reply. "But oh, what a change since last night!" continued the boy, half wild with delight, as the sun began to show a little over the edge of the horizon, flooding the world with golden light and turning the pale, silvery lake, as it were, into glowing fire. The boys only glanced for a moment or two at the glorious scene before them of lake and undulating country backed by mountains. Then, after tying the trailing lariat about the mule's neck, they mounted their ponies, all dripping as they were, ready for the march to camp, but only to suffer a chill of misery as the same thought struck both. Which was the way back? "Why, we shall never find them, coming here as we did, fast asleep as we must have been," groaned Ned. "The mule must have smelt the water far off," said Chris, "and found the way here." "Yes, but he won't find the way back to camp. What shall we do? What shall we do?" There was a piteous, despairing ring in Ned's voice as he sat gazing woefully in Chris's eyes. "We must go right away," said the latter thoughtfully, and then in a tone full of exultation, "We're a pretty pair. Look how plain the hoof marks are in the sand. Why, we've only got to pick up the trail and follow it back. There, you go that way and I'll go this. It can't be far away." "No, of course not," cried Ned, urging his pony forward in the direction indicated, while Chris started in the other, keeping close to the water's edge, where the sand was firm. But the mule was not going to be left alone, and followed Chris's mount. Not for far. Within 100 yards there were the hoof prints of the animals, going straight into the shallow lake on one side, and on the other leading straight away over the sandy plain, which here came right up to the water's edge. "Coo ee!" shouted Chris, and Ned came cantering back. "Found the trail?" he cried. "Yes, here it is, with the mule leading. That's where he walked right into the lake, and we've been abusing mules and calling them names ever since I can remember. Ned, I'll never be a brute to a mule again. Will you lead?" "No, you found the trail. Go on, and I'll come last, as fast as you can." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Peril Finders by George Fenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Matt Perard. Chapter 29. Desperate Straits. Chris uttered a wild whoop of delight. "Water! Water! Water!" he shouted. "Here we come!" The announcement was intended for those he had left at the camp, but the word seemed to be lost in the immensity of space. But he did not heed this, only pressed on, to halt at the end of 100 yards for the others to come up. His pony had lowered its head as if recognizing the track, and started off at a canter, but Chris realized directly that the progress did not depend upon him but the mule, which at starting refused to go in advance of Ned, and stubbornly stood still, and no urging would make it move. "Come on first, Ned," shouted Chris, as the efforts of his companion proved to be in vain. "Oh, he is a brute!" cried Ned. But he did as he was ordered, following his leader, and the mule, heavily laden as it was, lowered its head and began to lounge along last at the regular mule pace. "Oh, but this won't do!" cried Chris, as they came up. "I never thought of it when we were filling the barrels. It'll take no end of time to get back like this." He led on again in silence, seeing the trail marked plainly enough, and wonderfully straight, the animals having pretty well always stepped in their leader's tracks. But at the end of a few minutes' advance at a walk, he turned his head to shout back, "Oh, Ned, Ned, what shall we do? Everything, you see, depends on this mule, and he'll only keep to his regular pace. His load's too heavy. We must run half of it away." "What? Waste the water? No." "But it seems so heavy." "He wouldn't go a bit faster if you poured away nearly all." "I'm afraid not. groaned Chris. "What can we do? I say, I wonder how far it is to camp. Can you guess, Ned?" The boy shook his head. "It must be," continued Chris as he rode on, wrenching right round in his saddle and trusting to his mustang to follow the back trail, "just as far as the mule would walk from the time we started till daybreak this morning. Hours and hours and hours, all going so slowly, for we should have been woke up if they had broken into a fast trot. I'm afraid we must spill out some of the water. But I tell you that the slow wretch wouldn't go a bit faster. He's walking now just at the same rate as when the barrels were empty." Chris felt that these were the words of truth and remained silent. He would have gone behind the animal and bullied or urged it forward with blows, in spite of his late words, but he felt confident that the result would only be a stubborn fit, kicking, or perhaps lying down. A short time before the boy had felt in the highest glee. Success had attended their effort, and there seemed to be nothing else to do but hurry back to the fainting sufferers with the life giving fluid and receive their thanks and praise, while now, in addition to the bitter despair and misery, there was a fresh sensation, which he connected then with a feeling of sinking that made him gaze piteously at his companion, but only to be struck with his sunken eyes and agonized aspect. "Don't look like that, Ned," he said. "Why, you're worse than I am." "I can't help it. I feel quite ill. We shall never get back to them in time. Father looked as if he wouldn't be able to get up again." "So did my father." "I never saw him look so dreadful before. He must be in an awful state, or else he'd have been able to take something from the medicine chest to help him hold out longer. But there, it's of no use to give way like this. We must get back to camp with this water. Do you hear? We must." "Yes," said Ned mournfully, "we must. Chris." "Yes." "If I fall off my nag and can't get up again." "Oh, don't talk like that. It's idiotic." "I can't help it. If I fall over and lie still on the sand, I want you to promise me something." "Then I shan't," cried Chris shortly. "Get out. You're going to pretend that you'll lie down and die, and you're going to make your will." "No, it wasn't exactly that, but if you get back to them and are saved, you may have my 4-bladed knife with the stone pick and lancet in it." "Oh, hang your old knife!" cried Chris ungraciously. "I don't want it. Mine's ever so much better, and doesn't hurt your hand when you're cutting anything. Now, no nonsense. Fancying you're going to fall off your pony and not being able to get up again. Why, if you go on fancying such things as that in the hot sunshine, you're pretty well sure to turn giddy and go down. Look here." "Yes," sighed Ned. "I feel just as bad as you do, but I don't begin a lot of nonsense about leaving you my knife. Such stuff!" "It isn't stuff," sighed Ned. "I'm horribly ill now. So faint and strange." "Have some water. I'll get some out." "No, no, no. I've had enough. I don't feel a bit parched and thirsty now, for the water seems to have gone right into me from my wet clothes." "The same here," said Chris, after a glance over his shoulder to see if his pony was keeping to the return trail, and being convinced that he was. "I could talk like you, for I never felt so ill before. I say, how one's things are drying in the sunshine. I've quite done dripping." "Yes, but Chris, I haven't told you all I was going to say." "And you needn't. You were going to say that I might have your German silver pocket comb too." "I wasn't," said Ned reproachfully. "But you may, and everything else I've got, for I shall never want them again." "Yes, you will, stupid. Oh, I say, don't be such a Molly." Ned shook his head. "Won't you listen to me?" he said piteously. "Why, of course I will, old chap. I'm only talking like this because I want you to be plucky. Ned, you're not going to lie down and die. You can't. You shan't. I've felt like this for the last half hour, but I won't let myself believe that it's all through the despair and misery we feel." "But it is, Chris. I'm glad I came with you, though," said the poor fellow sadly. "So am I, and it was very jolly and chummy of you. Just like you, Ned. We've often had rows, but we always made it up again, and I never liked you any the less. Never half so much as I did when you came trotting after me to look for this water." "I like to hear you say that," said Ned, smiling faintly. "If you got safe back, I want you to think still in this way after I've gone." "After you've gone!" cried Chris passionately. "Oh, if we'd only plenty of time and weren't so faint, I should like to have the worst row with you that we ever try to fight out. You're not going to lie down and die. It would be absurd after we've got the water and—" Ned started and bent forward, holding on to the pommel of his saddle with both hands to steady himself, for as he rode almost backwards, Chris suddenly clutched at nothing and nearly fell from his seat. "There, there," panted Ned. "Oh, don't fall, Chris. One of us is enough. You mustn't fall and lie there, because I want you to do something for me." "Yes," said Chris softly, and with a wild‐eyed stare at his companion. "I want you to tell father that I held out to the last, and tried hard to do my duty as he told me to always." "Yes, yes," sighed Chris hoarsely. "I'll tell him, if I get back to camp. But, oh, Ned, it is so hard now, when we've got the water. All the strength is gone from me. I say, tell me, if we both fall out of our saddles and lie there, do you think that the ponies will go on to the camp?" "No, I'm sure they won't. They'll stop beside us, looking down in our faces with their big patient eyes. They won't stir for ever so long." "Ah," groaned Chris faintly, "and we shall have got the water for nothing." "No," said Ned. "The ponies will stop, but the mule won't. He'll keep right on along the back trail, and they'll get the water after all." "Ah," sighed Chris, with a bright light coming into his eyes. "Then it won't have been for nothing." "What are you doing?" said Ned more strongly, as he saw his comrade begin to unfasten the knotted silk kerchief about his neck. "Going to tie this to the chain. Father will know it's mine, and that it means good bye and—" The effort was too much. The giddiness from which he was suffering mastered him, and he fell over sidewise onto the fast heating sand, but with his left foot fast in the stirrup iron, while the pony kept on a few feet before stopping short and turning to gaze down in his rider's face. "Chris, Chris!" cried Ned, checking his pony as he closed up, while the mule went tramping on with its heavy load as if nothing whatever was the matter. To the last speaker's wonder and horror, as the excitement of his comrade's mishap drove his own sufferings into the background, Chris raised himself a little and extricated his foot from the stirrup, before hauling himself up by the leather, to stand steadying himself by the saddle, laughing the while what sounded to Ned like a wild, hysterical laugh that was to be his last. "Chris!" he cried. "It's all right," gasped the boy, struggling to grow calm. "That tumble has knocked the faintness out of me. I know now. What's the matter with us both?" "Chris!" rang out again. "I know. I tell you. I felt a little while ago. Oh, so ill, as if something was coming on and we were both going to die. But I know now. Can't you see, Ned?" There was no answer. "Then I'll tell you. What did you have to eat yesterday?" "Eat? I couldn't eat, only drink that little drop of water." "And I couldn't, and didn't have above half a meal the night before. Then we've been through so much ever since and drunk all that water, and the sun's been beating down on us." "What?" cried Ned, staring. "You mean it's because we're so hungry?" Why, of course it is. Now tumble off your pony and lie down and die if you dare." "Chris!" "That's it, I tell you, and you know it is. Oh dear, I feel so lightheaded and so empty and faint, and nothing else the matter with me at all, only that I'm so miserable because we can't get on faster." Ned sat staring and thinking hard, but he said no word in contradiction of his companion's theory. And there they stayed for quite 10 minutes, Ned seated in his saddle, Chris standing resting against his, and with his pony pressing against him as if to keep him upright. "Look at old Skeeter's brother," said Chris at last. "He must be his brother, because he's so like him." Ned looked in the same direction as his companion, to see that the mule had gone plodding on along the trail, flapping one ear to keep off the flies, and looking as if nothing would prevent it from going straight back to the camp. "I say, you feel better now, don't you?" said Chris suddenly. "I feel very ill and weak and giddy." "That's how I feel," said Chris, "and I'm afraid to try and get up into the saddle again. I know I shall go down bang." "No, no, don't," cried Ned excitedly. "Here, I'll get on the other side and take hold of your hand." "Shan't I pull you down too?" "No," said Ned, speaking more strongly. "I won't let you." "Catch hold then," cried Chris, as his comrade urged his nag alongside that of Chris, and then as they joined hands, the latter raised his left foot to the stirrup, sprang up, and dropped into the saddle with a sigh of relief. "Well done us," he panted. "Who'd ever have thought that being half starved would make two fellows feel like that?" "It was awful, wasn't it?" "Not so horrible as thinking about them all dying for want of water. Oh, Ned, 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 can't we get one barrel on your or my pony and ride on fast?" "No," said Ned decisively. "We couldn't hold it on, and we couldn't go fast." "And we couldn't fasten the other on the mule's back? Is there nothing else we could do?" "I can't see anything but going right on. Let's catch up to the mule now, and keep on talking so as to forget about being so faint. I say, how fast one's clothes dry." "Yes," said Chris, "and how cool one feels in spite of the sun coming down as if it would roast us. Do you know why it is?" "No," replied Ned. "I'll tell you, then. Father told me once. He said it was one of the laws of physics." "I say, don't talk about physics now." "Who was talking about physics, stupid? I said physics, natural science. Father said that in evaporation a feeling of coolness always comes on. That's what we feel now as the water in our clothes evaporates. He showed me how to cool water by filling a bottle and wrapping it in flannel, then keeping it wet and standing it in the sun. Yes, I knew that made it cooler, but I didn't know if it had anything to do with evaporation." "Then the water in the barrels must be nice and cool." "Nay, not it," said Chris sharply. "That's getting warm, because the outside of the barrels is not kept wet. Well, old Skeeter's brother, how are you getting on?" he cried, as they rode up one on either side of the mule, the only answer being the cocking of one ear in the speaker's direction, the other at Ned. "Let's give up worrying about it, Chris," said Ned at last. "We can do nothing else but keep on as we are, only hoping and praying that they're all lying down trying to sleep till we come. It's impossible to get on any faster." "Quite," said Chris despairingly. "I will hope and feel sure that all will turn out as it should. It must. It shall. I say, how long have we been coming since we started?" "I don't know, and I can't think," was the reply. "I say, I can't see the lake now," cried Chris. "It's all hidden by the thick hot haze that has closed in. Can you see the beautiful country and the mountains there still?" "No, nothing but the thick, hot, transparent mist and the sand and sagebrush everywhere behind, just as it is now in front. I say, how well old Muley keeps to the trail. I wish it wasn't so hazy. We should see the tent perhaps then." Ned turned off the conversation at a tangent, for the sight of a clump of stones gave him a subject full of interest. "Stones and rocky bits, with little heathery like bushes. I say, Chris, keep a good lookout. Isn't this the sort of country for rattlesnakes?" "Ugh!" ejaculated Chris. "I say, how horrible if the mule were to step on one of the nasty reptiles now. We should have to fit the barrels on one of the ponies and then take turns at walking. But let's try and guide them more away from the heath." They tried, but the mule resisted their efforts at once and showed a stern determination to keep to the trail while the ponies backed it up on either side. Then the conversation dropped, was resumed again twice, but in vain at last, for the heat and exertion were telling upon the poor lads, now to a terrible extent. Their eyes grew wild and bloodshot. The faintness came on with increased force and refused to be exorcised, with each brain swimming a little at first, then more and more, till a heavy, stupefying state of torpor supervened, and it was no longer the riders that directed their four-footed friends, but the latter leading them on and on hour after hour. Though the boys could not realize the fact, the sun had crossed the meridian and was slowly beginning to descend, when there was a sudden arousing from the torpor-like state brought about by the mule coming to a standstill with its legs spread out widely, hanging its head, while its drooping ears and starting eyes told plainly enough that it was suffering acutely from heat and exhaustion, its eyes seeming to say mutely, "The burden is too heavy, masters. If I stir another foot, I must drop." "Can we do something? Open one of the barrels and soak a handkerchief to hold it to the poor thing's mouth?" said Chris loudly. He meant it to be, but it was only a hoarse, harsh sound which came from his lips, while when he descended from his saddle to step towards the barrel nearest to him, it suddenly seemed to fade away into the haze through which they had been passing, and in his effort to catch it, poor Chris fell headlong to the ground and lay staring blankly upwards at Ned. Chapter 30 of The Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perord. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 30. Waking Up. "Oh, Chris," groaned Ned, as he dismounted feebly to fall on one knee by his companion's side. Chris's eyes followed every movement, and he seemed to hear what was said, for he smiled faintly. "That's you, isn't it, Ned?" he said slowly. "Can't see. Black spots floating about in front, and everything going round and round." Ned's answer was another groan, for the trouble was on the increase. The poor mule had done its best, and kept on till it could do no more. Just then it made an effort to go on again, looking wistfully at Ned, in whose acts it evidently read an order for it to advance. Drawing its legs together into a more natural attitude, it took a step or two, stumbled, and then dropped upon its knees, made another effort to rise, but failed, and doubled its hind legs under it, to crouch so that the two barrels rested on the sand. And then the poor beast uttered a long hoarse sigh, as if of relief, while for a time it made no further effort to stir. Ned glanced at the ponies, the thought occurring to him that he ought to secure their reins, but they did not display the slightest desire to leave their companion, only stretching out their necks towards the mule and breathing hard, before pressing forward slightly to begin snuffing at one of the barrels. This act set Ned's wits working, and he recalled what Chris was about to do. He was so faint and giddy that it required a painful effort even to stir, but he caught the kerchief from his companion's hand, and began to unfasten the well secured stopper of the nearest barrel, which stood steady enough now in the sand. This done, he thrust in about half of the kerchief, let it soak full of water, raised it carefully so that every superabundant drop should fall back into the barrel, and then, pressing open Chris's lips, squeezed a few drops between them, more and more as they were swallowed with avidity, and passed his wet hands over the prostrate lad's temples. This he did again and again, suffering an acute longing to treat himself in the same way, but resisting the temptation, till Chris closed his eyes with a weary sigh, his lips tightening together, and he lay motionless. Ned soaked the handkerchief again and pressed its contents in his own mouth, swallowing the moisture with avidity, noting the while that the two ponies were licking the farther barrel and breathing hard, as if they could feel the cool, fresh odor of the water playing in their nostrils, while at the same time the mule, pinned down by the weight of the two barrels, strained its neck round and whinnied as it looked piteously in his face. The look had its effect, for the end of the kerchief was once more thrust into the barrel, allowed to soak, and then drawn out. "I don't know how we're going to manage," thought the boy, as he held the dripping corner of the kerchief towards the mule's muzzle. But the poor brute did, and acted without hesitation, making a snap as sharply delivered as that of a dog, and catching the end between its strong teeth. Then it gave its head a toss, and treating the water bearing piece of fabric as if it were a wisp of wet grass, drew it, dripping and cool, right into its mouth, the sharp tug or two given overcoming Ned's resistance. Before the boy could recover from his surprise, there was a quick, juicy sound of champing in accord with the movement of the mule's jaws, a gulp, and the kerchief had gone. "You stupid brute!" cried Ned indignantly. "What am I to do now?" Common sense suggested what should be his next proceeding, and that was to take off his own handkerchief and his felt hat, which he turned inside out. Then, laying it beyond the mule's reach, he soaked the fresh kerchief till it would hold no more, squeezed it so that the contents fell into the reversed crown of his hat, and repeated the act till about half a pint of dirty water lay ready. This he held out to the mule, which plunged in its lips and rapidly sucked out every drop. Repeating the process, Ned managed to give each of the ponies enough to wash out its mouth. "If I only had a straw or a reed," thought the boy, but there was hardly a twig of the sagebrush to be seen, and he shook his head in despair. But there was something else to do. The mule was fidgeting, and any restive action on the beast's part might mean waste of water, so he hurriedly closed the tompion, leaving its brass chain so that there was no risk of loss, and this was hardly done before, refreshed by its portion, the mule made a desperate effort to rise, but only got his forelegs well planted, and then sank back. It made two more trials, but with less and less success, and then, apparently fully aware of the fact that the weight carried was too much for it, resignation ensued, and the poor beast lay partly over on its side between the barrels, and made no further effort beyond seeking for a restful position in which to lay its heavy head. This was fully stretched out in the sand, where the last thing Ned seemed to see was the twitching of the poor brute's long ears to rid itself of the flies which attacked it as if under the idea that they had found something dead. The sun's intense heat soon made the boy aware of the fact that his head was bare, and restoring his hat to its proper shape, he replaced it, finding it cool enough to enable him to think a little more clearly of his position and ask himself whether he could do anything more. He asked Chris the same question that he had put to himself, but there was no reply, for it was evident that the poor fellow had sunk into a complete state of stupor, and he was soon aware that he was fast following his friend's example, for the soft black spots began to float before his eyes, growing larger and larger, till they seemed to blot out the objects that had begun to sail slowly round and round. There was a little reaction after this, and he saw the mule's eyes closed and the two mustangs sniffing again at the farther barrel, and heard them sigh as if in weary disappointment at not being able to get at the contents. But Ned felt no trouble, for everything seemed to be restful now that he was convinced that he could do no more after doing his best. There was the glowing haze all around, and the terrible silence of the dusty plain, with the nearest objects standing out with wonderful clearness, till they began at last to sail slowly round and round him, while the black spots formed in front of his eyes, tiny distant specks at first, which gradually swelled and swelled till they grew soft and blurred, blacker and blacker too, as they blotted out the moving objects, and finally the glowing, hot, silvery haze, and then all was black darkness and silence profound. At last. Ned did not know what that meant. He did not hear any words spoken, nor how it was. It was his coming back into a state of consciousness, and all he felt was that it somehow was at last. Time had nothing to do with it, and the first consistent thought was that it rained hard, the next that something was stinging his nostrils as if hundreds of tiny points were being inserted into the soft, delicate skin. Soon after, he seemed to be listening to people talking a long way off. They were making remarks about some one else, but he had no idea what, till it was as if something cracked in each ear, and he started with his eyes wide open, to see that the sky above was all of a deep red glow, and on looking round him there were faces and mules and packs lying just as if they had been taken off the mules' packs. "He's coming round now," said a familiar voice, and then he started again, to find that everything was clear, and that he was looking in the doctor's face. "Is he?" said Ned sharply, in a voice that he did not know for his own. "Has he been very bad?" "Worse than any of us, Ned, my boy," said another familiar voice. "Is that you, father?" cried Ned. "What's left of me, my boy. I began to think we should never shake hands again. You two fellows saved our lives." Ned was silent, and lay with his hand pressed to his forehead, waiting till he could quite grasp that which seemed to be dancing strangely in his brain. "No, father," he said at length. "I recollect now. We did try, but we couldn't. We broke down." "Yes," said the doctor, "but just where we could find you when we were struggling on and nearly at the last gasp." "I don't understand you, Mr. Lee. Who's that? Griggs?" "Yes, it's me," said the American. "But I'm feeling pretty thin, my lad, I can tell you. May I shake hands?" "Why, of course," cried Ned. "Come away from him now," said the doctor in a whisper. "I'm rather troubled about his head." "Oh, it don't ache now," said Ned sharply, And things are not going around now. But you said Chris was better?" "Yes, he's sleeping under the tent. I kept you here because there is more air." "Where are we?" asked Ned anxiously. "Just in the same spot as when we found you, with the mule broken down under the heavy load of water." "Of course, I remember it all now," cried Ned excitedly. "I broke down first, and after I got better it was poor old Chris. But he's all right now?" "He will be soon," said the doctor. "Can you tell us how far it is to the water, Ned?" said Wilton, making himself heard for the first time. "No," said Ned thoughtfully, "but I'm afraid it's a long way. Why?" "Because we've finished one of the barrels and half of the other, my boy," said Bourne. "We must be getting on again, then, doctor?" "Yes, as soon as they can sit their horses." "Can't be very far, sir," said Griggs, because of the time they were away. "Say, Ned, my lad, can you tell us when you started back with the water?" "Yes," said the boy, "directly after sunrise." "And when did the mule cave in?" "I don't quite know, because my head felt so thick, but it was when the sun was hottest. I think I could show you the way, though." "Oh, we can find the way, Squire. You have written that down clearly enough in the sand." "Tell us one more thing, though," said Griggs. "What did you find? A rock spring or a pool?" "A great lake that stretched out as far as we could see." There was a faint cheer at this, and the boys smiled. "But there are big 'gators in it." "I don't care if there are crocodiles in it half a mile long," cried Griggs. "We're going to have our share. Then it's beyond the salt desert?" "Oh yes, beautiful green country, with mountains and trees." "Within half a day's journey," said the doctor. "Then I think we may give the poor beasts what water there is left." "Yes, sir," said Griggs. "I'll give 'em my share, but I never grudged parting with it so much before in my life. Shall I begin?" "Yes, poor things. But they will not have much apiece even now." Griggs laughed. "No, sir," he said. "Skeeter would get outside the whole half barrel if you gave him a chance, and then roll round the whites of his eyes and ask for more." By the time the water had been given to the beasts, all but a small portion reserved for the two boys, it was dark, with the stars just dimly seen through the haze. All was ready, and the mules and horses stepped out briskly, the last drink having worked wonders, but probably the wonderful instinct of the mules taught them that they were nearing the end of their horribly toilsome journey. Perhaps it is not too much to say that by some subtle power of communication they had learned the fact from those which had made the journey before. Certainly our dumb friends do communicate good and bad information to one another. Neither Chris nor Ned seemed much the worse since they had had a light meal, but sat their ponies well enough once more, while there was no need for their guidance, for the mule which had borne the water barrels, unladen now, having been placed with the bell bearer in front, started off freely enough and needed no guidance to keep it to the track. Naturally enough the two boys rode that night knee to knee with the doctor and Bourne, each giving and receiving a faithful account of their proceedings, and the lads too learning exactly what had taken place on the awakening at the camp, when, utterly worn out and suffering, not one of the four felt in a fit condition to stir, Griggs, naturally the strongest of the party and best able to cope with the arduous work, being by far the worst. But he was the first to recover upon the discovery being made that the boys were gone. In fact, he took note of everything during the first few minutes, and was able to point out that they had taken with them a mule bearing the 2 water barrels, and also found and pointed out the trail the 2 ponies and the mule had made in the parching sand. No one felt fit to stir, and the beasts of burden seemed to be in worse plight than their masters. But the doctor insisted upon a start being made at once, following upon the trail, and all expected to come before long upon the pair lying dead from thirst and exhaustion at the end of the track. "We never expected to see you alive again, Chris," said the doctor, "and when we came upon you at last, just as we all felt that we could go no farther, we stopped short, no one daring to approach, for we found you lying just as we had pictured you. The expedition was to all of us quite at an end, and we approached you at last to lie down by your sides and die, when Griggs saw something that neither I nor Ned's father had noted." "What was that, father?" asked Chris. "That the mule's head was pointing in our direction, and that the trail on ahead was blurred, showing that you had been somewhere and were on the way back. The next minute he was shouting frantically for us to come on, and we did, having literally crawled up to find you both alive and the 2 casks full of that which saved our lives. That night camp was made in the midst of plenty, and the sun rose in the morning over the thick desert heated air to shine upon the dazzling waters of the lake and the rich forest land spreading upward towards a range of mountains of a vivid blue. It seemed to be the land of plenty that they had reached, where abundance of game awaited the rifle, fish in shoals were in the lake, and, most attractive of all, away on the horizon, amidst the range of mountains running to right and left, were peaks among any of which the golden city of which they were in search might be waiting to be compared with the unfortunate old prospector's map. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of the Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 31. Off Again. A short halt of a day or two only was made by the lake at first, and then an excursion which had been made successfully in search of game having resulted in the discovery of a more suitable spot higher up towards the mountains, a week was spent there, in a beautiful little valley, where an abundant stream of crystal purity emptied itself into the wide-spreading lake. Pasturage was there for the horses and mules, and almost without effort food was to be had at the expense of a few cartridges, while very little skill was needed for Griggs and the boys to draw salmon-like and trout-like fish to the banks. In a day or two the perils and sufferings of the journey across the salt plains were forgotten, and careful searching for signs of Indians having proved that they were the sole occupants of the district, the whole party gave themselves up to the pleasures of the peaceful life they were enjoying. But not for long. Griggs had entered into the spirit of the chase, the fishing, and the search for vegetable food. He was as eager too when the doctor led excursions into gully and up hillsides of a part of the world that seemed to the adventurers as if it had never before been trodden by the foot of man, and ready to point out fresh flowers or indications of metal or other minerals where the cliff was bared or splintered by some fall from above. But over the camp fire at night, in some rocky nook or beneath the spreading boughs of a gigantic spruce fir, a hint or a word or two brought him back to the prime motive of their journey. "I'm ready when you are, gentlemen," he cried. "I don't say this isn't grand, and that we oughtn't be as happy as the day is long in a place like this, but we didn't come out here only to enjoy a hunting party. There's that map, you know." "Yes," said the doctor gravely, "there's the map. And you don't think this is a likely part of the country?" "Not down here, sir. but from where we stood today after stalking those birds, I could see the mountains opening out in a gulch and rift and hollow, beyond which there was peak and point and pass that looked as much like the sort of country as could be." "I noted that grand scenery, too," said the doctor. "And I," added Wilton. "It made me long to begin exploring again, for there was no sign of desert that I could see." "It's a grand country," said Bourne, "and the wonder to me is that it has not been settled." "Why do you laugh, boy?" "Oh, it was only at something I thought, sir," said Chris. "What was it?" "That the salt plains were enough to keep anybody from coming as far as this." "That's it, my lad," said Griggs. "Men may have come prospecting in this direction for gold, but I shouldn't be a bit surprised to find that this is only a patch of good land round and about these mountains, and that if we went far enough in any direction we should come to the salt plains again, shutting it in and keeping people back." "It is possible," said the doctor. "It's more than likely, sir. If it were not so, wouldn't people have settled here?" "It is very far from civilization, Griggs," said Bourne. "Most new places are far from civilization, sir," cried Griggs. "But look all around here, sir. If a good strong party of men came here with their wives and children, they'd make their own civilization, for it seems to me that we can find here already pretty well everything a man could want. See what it would be after a few years of farm stock rearing and gardening." "Then why not stop and settle here?" said the doctor, smiling. "Because we've got gold on the brain, sir," replied Griggs grimly. "We set ourselves to see if that poor fellow's story was a fact, and having started, I say let's carry out our work. If we don't find out that his map told the truth, I'm ready to come and open out this bit of country, if you like, for it's 10 times the place that we came from. Even now, if you say we'll go no further, I'll set to work with you, but because it's so beautiful, ought we to forget how we're cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world?" "No," said the doctor emphatically. "I propose we make a fresh start to morrow, farther up the mountains, and see what there is yonder." There was a murmur of agreement at this, in which the boys joined. "Yes," said Chris, as he sauntered away soon after with his eyes roaming in every direction in search of danger or something new. "Griggs is right. It's as fine here, and I don't like leaving the fishing, but I'm beginning to want a change. Aren't you?" "No going down hill again to be roasted and choked with thirst." "Of course not," said Chris. "We've had enough of that. I want to do some of that shooting Griggs was talking about last night." "What, the goats up in the mountains?" "Yes, and those big horned sheep. But I feel sure he was laughing at us about their jumping about the precipices, and running along ledges full gallop when they're only a few inches wide." "Oh, I don't know. He hadn't got that queer cock of the eye that he has when he's spinning a yarn." "Well, no. But it was a good deal like throwing the hatchet. Didn't you see how serious your father looked?" "Yes, but not so serious as your father did when Griggs declared that he'd seen flocks of those sheep running away from people, stalking them till they got to the edges of the precipices where they could go no farther, and then jump down head first so as to come on with great thick twisted horns which cover their foreheads, and bounce up again and go on running along a lower part." "Yes, I saw. Why, a big heavy sheep, if he came down like that, would break his horns." "Break his horns!" cried Ned. "He'd break his neck." "I should like to shoot one of those fellows," said Chris. "Or be below when one of them jumped, came down on his head and broke his neck," said Say. "I say, mutton, neck of mutton, leg of mutton. Wouldn't a good roast joint be a treat?" "Oh, what a fellow you are for thinking about eating!" cried Chris impatiently. "And so are you for drinking," replied Ned. "You're always on the look out for water." "Well, we must drink a great deal in such a thirsty land." "Yes, and we must eat a deal to keep up one's strength," said Ned. "I can't help getting hungry when we're walking about so much. I suppose it's because I'm growing fast." "Yah, that's it," said Chris, smiling. "I get very hungry too. It's all right, I won't laugh at you any more. I say, what lots of those little gophers there are here. Look there. Why, there must be about 100 up on that patch of sandy ground. watching us to see if we're coming, and ready to pop into their holes." "I see them. There's one of those little round tots of owls sitting there, too, just outside the burrow. It's quite comic to see the Gophers living so sociably with the little owls." Chris gave a shout just then, and the colony of little burrowing animals, resembling the marmots of the Alps, disappeared into their holes, with the accompaniment of angry warning whistles, just as a huge eagle came sailing along overhead, swooping so near that a good marksman could easily have brought it down. "Seems a pity to go away from a place where there's so much to see," said Chris after a time. "And what for? To find gold? Well, it's only yellow metal. We might stay here and find some." "Or silver," said Ned. "Yes, or lead, or antimony." "Or coal?" cried Ned. "Ah, that would be useful for making our cooking fire," said Chris. "But there's plenty of wood everywhere, and I won't complain. I want to go on and see more. Every place we come to seems more wonderful than the last, and there's no knowing what we may find next." "We shall see," said Ned, yawning, for the darkness was sweeping up the sides of the hills, leaving the hollows black, and they had had a long and tiring day. "I suppose we shall start then to morrow." "For a certainty. I wonder what our next camping place may be like." "That ruined city described by the old prospector, perhaps," said Ned, laughing. "But what are we going to do then? Load the mules with gold and go back again?" "I hope not," cried Chris. "I don't want to go back. Why, we haven't shot a buffalo yet." "So much better for the buffalo," said Ned, yawning again. "I say, don't do that!" cried Chris querulously. "I wasn't doing anything." "Yes, you were, opening your mouth as wide as you could, just like old Skeeter when he's getting ready to bray." "Whinny," said Ned correctively. "He isn't a donkey." "I know that. He can't bray. He whinnies and squeals. But he tries to bray, and opens his mouth just like you do." "Perhaps so," said Ned, changing the conversation at once. "I say, doesn't that peak look beautiful? It's just as if it's red hot." "You'd find it pretty cold if you were up there," said Chris, giving up making rude allusions to his companion's yawning. "Yes, that always seems to me so strange," said Ned. "What does?" "That the nearer you get to the sun the colder it is. It ought to be hotter." "Don't find fault with nature," said Chris dogmatically. "I wasn't finding fault. I only say it seems queer. I want to thoroughly understand why it is." "Ask your father. He knows." "I did," said Ned, "and he said it was because the atmosphere was thinner the higher you got." "Then the lower you get I suppose the thicker it is," said Chris thoughtfully. "And that's why it's so thick and hot down there on the salt desert. Oh, my word, how it used to scorch! It was just as if the haze was one great burning glass." "Oh, I say," cried Ned dolefully, "I wish you wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" "Talk about the heat on the salt plains. We're going to start off afresh to morrow morning, and I shall begin dreaming about what we went through over yonder." "Poor old chap." "Ah, you may laugh, but it'll all come back like a nightmare, with the burning thirst and giddiness, and the black spots before one's eyes." "That's biliousness," said Chris, speaking authoritatively, like a doctor's son. "I don't care what it is. It's very horrible," said Ned, "and if I thought we were going through a time like that again, I should want to stop at home." "Where's that?" asked Chris dryly. "Ah, to be sure," said Ned with a sigh. "I forgot where we were. I suppose there would be no home again until we found the gold." "And that won't be to night," said Chris, as a shrill whistle rang out through the clear evening air. "There's old Griggs calling us just as if we were dogs. I've a good mind not to hear." But Chris answered the whistle all the same, and the boys were soon after joined by the American, who had come to meet them, and his first words were, "Now, boys, bed and a good long sleep. We're off again at daybreak." End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of the Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 32. Petra the Second. Daybreak came all too soon for Chris, who sprang up rubbing his eyes and yawning, in response to a summons from Griggs, who stood over the boy like a black figure cut out of cardboard showing against a ruddy glow. "Why, oh, bother, it can't be time!" cried the boy. "Yes, it is, and we're late." "So we are. You said daylight, and the sun's rising." "Is it?" said Griggs. "Then it's before its time. There, unbutton your eyelids and look again. The sun doesn't crackle and spit when it gets over the world's edge." "Huh!" grunted Chris, as he realised the truth that a roaring fire of pine wood was burning in a sheltered spot. "Have you woke Ned?" "Yes, and he's growling for his breakfast. Going to have a sluice first?" "You'll just have time." Griggs went back to see after the breakfast, and Chris turned to where Ned had lain down on a fragrant pine bough couch. "Here, look sharp," he said. "I suppose we must have a dose of cold water." Ned grunted, and seemed as ill-humoured as his companion at being awakened from sleep, and the pair hurried through the gloom to the side of the gully, where there was a soft splashing roar, caused by water falling like so much foam from a ledge about 100 feet above their heads into a rock pool at their feet. The boys' preparations did not take long, neither did the application of their bath. Chris stepped into the rock pool, took a couple of paces, and stood right in the middle of the descending broken water, uttered a gasp or two, stepped out, and began to apply a rough home-made towel with tremendous energy. "Is it cold?" said Ned, with a preliminary shiver. "Ugh, horrid!" was the smothered reply. The words seemed to check Ned, but the shock had to be suffered, and he too stepped into the natural shower bath, and sprang out again to follow his companion's example. "Feel sleepy now?" cried Chris with a laugh, and in quite a different tone of voice. "Sleepy? Who could?" was the reply, punctuated with gasps. "My, isn't it icy this morning?" "Yes. Washed all the snarl out of you, old chap," said Chris merrily. "I say, you did sound disagreeable." "Oh, I like that," said Ned. "Why, a bear with a sore head was nothing to you." "Huh!" grunted Chris, feeling too guilty to defend himself. "I say, feel cold now?" "No, burning hot," was the reply. "I say, what a pity there are not falls like this all over the salt desert." "There'd be no salt desert if there were," said Chris, who was now dressing rapidly in the increasing light. "They'd soon wash all the salt away. Look sharp, old Griggs will be shouting directly." The word "breakfast" came almost as he spoke, and as the boys hurried towards the fire, fully alert now and ready for anything, they saw that the mules were all laden but the one which carried the kitchen, as they called it, and this beast was feasting in company with the ponies. "Oh, I say, father, it isn't fair," cried Chris in response to the morning greeting. "You know I like to help load." "Yes, my boy, but we woke up earlier than usual, and I wanted you two to have a good rest, for we shall have a long day." Ned was making a similar protest to his father, who responded by telling him that he would be tired enough before night. The words proved to be quite true, for they had a long, long journey through rugged valley, up steep mountainside, down precipitous gulch, and across many a roaring torrent, one of which necessitated the use of knotted together ropes to ensure that the mules with their loads were not swept away. For in spite of the descents they were gradually ascending into a higher mountainous region, which grew more and more grand, while, notwithstanding the fierce heat of the sun, fatigue seemed non-existent as the party drank in the strong, invigorating air. The ideas that had been suggested about this part of the country being island-like, rising out of a vast sea of salt desert, were proved to be correct, for during quite a fortnight's journeyings here and there they obtained glimpses in the far distance of the glistening plains over which hung the cloud-like haze of heat. But whenever, after scaling some height, their approach towards the boundaries of the island was revealed, the doctor called a halt, and after a discussion with Griggs they struck off in a fresh direction through what proved to be a perfect wonderland of mountain gorge and forest, a home of wild animals and birds, every valley and plain furnishing supplies, while the want of water was never once felt. "Why, we must have pretty well explored this part of the country," said Wilton one evening, as they sat resting and watching the sun dying out amongst the peaks. "A little bit of it, sir," said Griggs dryly, "just to show us how we might spend a year or two." "What!" cried Wilton, with a mocking laugh. "If we started west to morrow, in a couple of good marches we should be right out on the salt plains again." "Perhaps so, but this America's a bigger place than you think for, sir. We're going southwest to morrow, aren't we, doctor, so as to get a lookout from that double topped mountain where the tongue of desert came right in?" "Yes, that is what I proposed," said the doctor. "He is quite right, Wilton. We have seen only a little of one of the grandest parts of the country I have been in." "Like some of the Rockies, sir," said Griggs enthusiastically. "I guess that Mr. Wilton will alter his opinion as we go on." "Perhaps," said Wilton good humouredly. "I don't mind. It is, as you folks say, very grand." "Grander than you think, sir," said Griggs. "I went higher than the doctor yesterday, and I think we're going to have a surprise to morrow." The surprise did not come the next day, as Griggs had prophesied, but 2 days later, when after an arduous struggle through a wild ravine, with the perpendicular cliffs rising to such a height on either side that the bottom was in twilight at midday, they took advantage of a fall of water to halt and refresh their ponies and mules, letting them drink their fill, and then begin cropping the rich grass growing near, while wallets were opened, and the tired party lay about partaking, with excellent appetite, of the provisions they had brought with them. "This is about the wildest place we've been in yet, father," said Chris, as he looked up at the mighty cliffs by which they were enclosed. The doctor nodded, but Wilton, who heard the remark, made reply. "Yes," he said, "I shouldn't care about being here in a storm. I should expect to have the rocks loosened by every peal of thunder, and come tumbling down upon our heads." "A frightful gorge," said Bourne. "But we seem to have come to the end. It closes in yonder. A regular blind lead." "Just the sort of place where we ought to search for minerals," said the doctor. "Why don't you come and lie down for a rest, Griggs?" cried Ned, for the American, after hurrying through his lunch, had gone forward 100 yards or so to begin climbing up from ledge to ledge, pausing to look round from time to time. He heard Ned's question, which came to his ears like a strange whisper, and then again louder, as if it was reflected from the rock face on his left, but he only waved his hand by way of reply, and went on climbing higher. "If he were not as active as a goat," said the doctor, "I should feel nervous and expect to see him fall." "Yes, it is very risky," said Bourne thoughtfully, "and, though we have you with us, a broken limb would not add to the comfort of our journey." "Oh, Griggs won't fall," said Chris decisively. "He's going up there to see where the spring comes from." "No," said the doctor. "He is climbing up beside the fall because the water has worn the gully into rough steps and formed a staircase by which we might get out of this gorge and perhaps find ourselves in another, perhaps wilder valley." "What's he doing now?" "Chipping at the stones by the waterside to see if there's any gold," said Ned, who was watching their companion attentively. "But he hasn't found any, for he's going on." This was the case, and at last they saw him come to a stand, as if unwilling or unable to go any farther. "Quite a blind lead there," said the doctor. "You wouldn't attempt to take the mules up there, would you?" said Wilton, "even if he said it was passable?" "No, it would be folly. Too much risk. We'll go back soon and try some other way." "Here he comes back," said Chris, as he saw the American turn and begin to descend by another way, leaving the rushing torrent above him and following the sharp descent into the bottom of the gorge, along which he made his way till he was level with and joined them. "Find the door locked?" said Wilton, laughing. "No," was the reply, as the American stretched himself on the grass. "No? You couldn't have got along that way any further, could you?" said the doctor. "Oh yes. The place seems to come to a blank end from here, but from up yonder you can see that it doubles back round a sharp corner to the left." "But the mules couldn't get by." "Oh yes. It looks narrow, but not so straight as that. We can ride along." "Indeed!" cried Bourne, while the boys listened eagerly. "I half thought we should have to go back, but it's all right. This place only zigzags a bit, and we can get through into the next valley when the beasts have had their feed. It's much better to go forward than journey back." "Did you find anything when you were chipping up there?" said Ned. "Yes," replied the American coolly. "There's gold in the rock up yonder by the water, and I found this in one little hole." He took a scrap of yellow metal from his pocket and held it out to the doctor. "A nugget of gold," said that gentleman, very much worn by the water. "And the stones," said Griggs sharply. "And no wonder, for it was being swept round and round. One minute I could see it, the next it was gone, but it was washed right into my hand at last. I dare say we might wash a good deal here." "But do you not propose to stop?" "No, sir. I've an idea that this is the most likely part we've come to yet. Let's go on. We could come back then if we found nothing better." Griggs's remarks roused the interest of all present, and at the end of half an hour, spent by the boys in washing the sand in a pool lower down, where they found a few scales of the rich metal, the journey was continued, Griggs leading, to where all further progress seemed impossible, for they were compelled to halt by the apparent closing in of the gorge, which presented, in fact, an unclimbable precipice. A few steps farther there was a narrow rift, extending from their feet to the top of the cliff a couple of thousand feet above their heads, and literally doubling back into this, they threaded their way along a passage not 20 feet in width, which zigzagged here and there for about a quarter of a mile, deeper and deeper into the mountains, growing more and more gloomy, and then all at once displaying the bright glow of sunshine right in front, as if it came round an elbow of the way. A few minutes later Griggs led the party into a vast amphitheatre, walled in by towering walls that were on the whole perpendicular, but seamed with rifts running up to natural terraces or breaks in the strata of which the vast walls were composed. The change from the gloom of the zigzag ravine along which they had made their way to the sunlit amphitheatre was almost painful, and the party stood in a group shading their eyes, gazing about in silence, till Chris suddenly snatched off his hat, waved it in the air, and with a shout startled the mules into the beginning of a stampede. But this was nipped in the bud, and as soon as the animals were calmed down the boy cried excitedly: "I didn't mean to do that, but I say, we've found the old city at last." "Nay," cried Griggs, shaking his head, "this don't go on all fours on our map." "But it's a city," cried Ned eagerly. "It's precious old, and look all along there, and up yonder, and down that bit, everywhere there are houses with doorways and windows. Why, there's quite one side of a street along at the back of that shelf." "Yes, boys, it's a city sure enough," said the doctor almost as excitedly as the lads. "Why, Griggs, this must be one of the old pueblas that the Spaniards talked about." "Yes, sir, that's it, sure enough. A city cut out of the rock faces of this great shut-in place. Why, it must have been a regular stronghold where thousands of people lived, and we've hit upon the way in. I shouldn't wonder if there's no way out." "Oh, there may be at the end yonder. How far is it to where that great rock wall closes in?" "Mile and a quarter, I should say," replied the American. "Then at the widest part yonder it must be nearly half a mile across," cried Bourne. "Hardly, sir. Say quarter, and here and there not half that." "But the cliffs seem about the same height," cried Chris, "just as if they'd been cut level." "Nature has cut them," cried Griggs, laughing. "Seems to me that it's just one great fault in a bit of tableland." "But how could it come so regular?" said Wilton thoughtfully. "Who knows, sir? Earthquake, perhaps, or shrinking. Anyhow, here it is, regular rock city, such as we've read about, and the old folks made it by cutting away, chopped it out of the stone, and by filling up and securing the openings." "But look at the terraces one above the other. They must have built those." "Nay, squire, those regular lines are just how the rocks form in ledges and cracks. I s'pose, doctor, we shan't go any further to-day." Chapter 33
of The Peril Finders by George Fenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 33. The Water Search. "Certainly not," cried the doctor. "We must explore this place. But it looks so fresh that most likely we shall find a tribe of Indians living here still." "Nay," said Griggs, shaking his head as his keen eyes wandered from place to place along the vast opening. "Indians who lived here must have had horses for going about, and there isn't a sign of one anywhere. Besides, if there had been any Indians we should have had some of them showing. The fighting men might be away, but there'd be their wives and papooses skulking here and there." "Yes, a city of the dead," said the doctor, sweeping the sides of the amphitheatre with his glass. "Not a sign of life but some marmot-like animals yonder. And, as far as I know, there are no Indians who build or carve out such houses as these living now, except the Puebla Indians. Well, this is a discovery indeed. We're bound to find some interesting relics here if other travellers have not been beforehand with us." "Then we shall camp here for a day or two, father?" cried Chris eagerly. "Let's ride on to the end and see if there's a way out yonder." "Yes, it will be as well," said the doctor, "and at the same time we can select our camp. But the first thing is to find water." "If there is none we must go back to that torrent where the gold was found." "And make some excursions here," said Wilton. "Must be water somewhere here, sir," said Griggs uneasily. "There must have been a strong tribe living here at some time, hundreds of them perhaps, and they couldn't live without drinking." There was a desolate look about the newly discovered city, but the bottom between the vast walls was every here and there verdant with grass and shrub, while the walls themselves were dotted with the growth of ages. Bushes were everywhere, while in every crack and cleft trees had taken root, some being of a pendant growth, spreading graceful boughs which waved in the soft wind that from time to time swept through the great depression. "Let's leave the mules to browse here," said the doctor. "There's enough of this short bush to keep them together while we ride on and explore, for I think we may make sure that we have the place to ourselves." "I won't say yes to that yet, sir," said Griggs dryly, "not till we've had a good look round. And first thing I've got to say is, where's Snakes?" "What?" cried the boys in a breath. "Where's Snakes, as aforesaid, neighbours?" repeated the American. "You may depend upon it some of those gentlemen came creeping or tumbling down from the flats above, found the premises convenient, and are living with large families up in some of these houses." These words had a strange effect upon the listeners. It was as if all the interest in the place had been crashed out. All desire to explore the wonders of this old city of the past had died away on the instant. As for the boys, their adventures in the desert came back, and clearly standing out were the creeping and writhing poisonous reptiles whose stroke meant a horrible death, lurking ready for them wherever they turned, and a shudder ran through them as if they had just been swept by some icy wind. Then the doctor spoke. "That's a horrible notion of yours, Griggs," he said, "but after all it's only a guess. There may not be a reptile here." "So much the better for us, sir," cried the American cheerily. "But all the same I say it once more, where's Snakes?" "Yes. You all have a shot cartridge ready?" said the doctor. "Yes," came back. One word, and everybody unslung his double piece. "The mules," said the doctor then. "We must not have them bitten." "They'll be pretty safe where they're grazing," said Griggs coolly. "Rattlesnakes don't care for places like that. It's in the stony sandy bits where they can get the full heat of the sun that there is most risk." "Yes," said the doctor thoughtfully. "Perhaps we might leave them as they are." "And pick our way slowly and carefully, doctor. Shall I go first?" "I don't like setting you always where there is most danger," replied the doctor. "None for me here," replied Griggs. "It's my poor mustang who has to run the risk, but I'll try and save him all I can." "How?" "Well, I've a sort of idea that I can manage it this way," replied the American, re-slinging his rifle and taking out his strong keen-edged hunting knife after dismounting and throwing his rein upon the ground over his pony's head. The sturdy little creature stood gazing at it as if full of the belief that the rein held it fast to a peg driven firmly into the ground, and never attempting to move, while its master stepped to a clump of young fir trees, selecting a sapling about a dozen feet high and cutting it off close to the ground. This done, he proceeded quickly to lop off all the horizontal branches close to the stem, clearing them quickly away all but the thick top, where he left a tuft, and on finishing had provided himself with a rough lance whose green brush-like top furnished him with the weapon of offence and defence with which he intended to protect his pony. "What are you going to do?" asked Chris, who had been watching him intently. "You come next and see," was the reply. "Now, gentlemen, I'll lead. Please follow in single file." Griggs sent his pony forward at a walk towards the far end of the amphitheatre, holding the fir pole well balanced and low down in front, while, rising in his stirrups, he bent forward, lancer-like, keeping his eyes fixed upon the ground before him, over which he guided his mount. In this way he advanced, still keeping at a walk, avoiding every dangerous-looking spot, keeping to the open, and wherever there was the possibility of a lurking enemy being at hand, the tuft at the point of the pole was lowered to the ground and used as a beater to drive out any reptile that might be there. At the commencement the mustang seemed disposed to start and shy, but a few soothing words calmed it, and as if divining the object in view, it stepped out finally, only uttering a snort or two when the green head of the spear was thrustled about, the snort sounding as if given to help scare any danger away. "Don't seem to be any, Griggs," said Chris. "Not yet, my lad," was the reply. "You see, I'm picking out the least likely bits, but one never knows." "There goes one!" shouted Chris the next moment, and he raised his piece to his shoulder. "Don't fire, he's got well into cover," cried Griggs. "It was a snake, but I don't think it was a rattler, for he didn't talk with his tail." "No, I didn't hear him rattle. Why did you tell me not to fire?" "Because you wouldn't have hit the brute, only wasted a cartridge." There had been no check, and they rode slowly on till the end of the depression had been reached, Griggs' plan resulting in starting off altogether 5 dangerous-looking serpents from the spots where they lay ready to scuttle in amongst the growth at the first movement of the extemporized weapon, the last of the fleeing reptiles proving its dangerous nature as it hurried away by giving off a harsh, dull, rattling sound with its quivering tail. A careful examination was made to the left without effect, and another to the right, but everywhere they were faced by the precipitous wall of cliff, carved out and terraced, and here and there offering facilities for climbing up more or less high, the stones from above having fallen from the weakening and decay of time till a glacis-like slope had been formed. But after the reptiles had been startled in the less likely places, there was no present temptation for ascending the stony slopes, bathed in the hot sunshine and looking thoroughly suited for the home of the dangerous creatures. This exploration of the lower part of the amphitheatre, ravine or depression, tempted farther search, the party riding on, and after examining cautiously the sides, visiting the upper portion near the zigzag gorge by which they had entered, but only to find that there was no other means of access to the city unless by a descent from the tableland in which the place seemed to be formed. "And snakes seem to be the only inhabitants," said Chris to his companion. "Why, Griggs, we can't stop here." "Not unless we can find water," said the American. "And not even then," replied the boy, "with the risk of getting bitten." "If there are no more than we started, we're not going to give up for that," said Griggs coolly. "Why, they're quite scarce." "But we haven't been upward on those terraces. They may be swarming there," cried Chris. "Yes, and there may be none. We don't want to go up there to-day. What we want is water. Now, where is it?" "Nowhere, seemingly." "Oh, that notion won't do," said the American. "Here, it's plain enough that once upon a time this was a big place with no end of people living in it." "Yes, so my father thought." "Very well then. I dare say it was just such a dry, hot place as it is now, and they must have had water close at hand, or they wouldn't have settled here." "They got it out of the gully through which we came." "No, that won't do," cried Griggs. "This was the old people's stronghold, where they could be safe and set all their enemies at defiance. Everything points to that, don't it?" "I think so," said Chris grudgingly. "Well, then, it isn't likely that they would depend on a fall of water from which the first enemies who attacked them could cut them off and leave them to die of thirst." "I never thought of that," said Chris, as, separated now from the rest, they allowed their ponies to pace slowly on, nibbling off such juicy shoots as came in their way. "It isn't likely," said Griggs. "There must be water somewhere. A fine fall that comes down from the plain up above, or they wouldn't have chosen this spot." "Perhaps there used to be one, and it has dried up." "Nay, the place is too green. Water must come on the high ground somewhere and find its way into this great hollow. Anyhow, it's out of sight, so it's underneath somewhere." "Then we shan't find it." "I don't know about that, my lad," replied the American, with a little laugh. "There's other senses besides seeing." "Yes, smelling," said Chris, with a smile. "But we can't find it that way." "Don't you be in too great a hurry, my lad. We're going to have another good hunt round at the bottom of these great cliffs, and if that comes to nothing we might try smelling." "Ah, nothing but a dog would be any use there." "In a hurry again, boy. I'd back something else to find water before a dog." "A fish on dry land?" "Tchah, no. What was it found the lake for us the other day?" "The mule!" cried Chris. "Got it again," said Griggs, laughing. "I don't say he would, but I shouldn't at all wonder if we brought old Skeeter round, as like as not he'd smell out the place." "Buried under some of these great stone slides that have come down?" "To be sure, my lad. Now that's a likely place." Griggs pointed to a huge gap in the cliff away to their right, where the carved out openings running along behind a rough terrace 100 feet up the vast wall suddenly ceased as if broken off, and commenced again at about the same height on the other side of the gap. "Let's go and look then," said Chris. "But it doesn't seem very likely, for it's all one bank of piled up stones." "That have run down from up yonder like those avalanches we read about. Mind how you come, for it's a snaky looking bit. Go on, old chap. I'll sweep the way for you with my fir pole." Chris felt a creepy sensation at the allusion to snakes, and his eyes looked very wide open as he followed close behind his companion, whose pony picked its steps with the greatest caution, the way growing more and more encumbered with stones as they neared the slope which filled up the gap. "It looks as if there had been an earthquake. What a roar there must have been when these stones came tumbling down." "More likely that water had been coming down in a regular stream for hundreds and hundreds of years, till all the earth and small stones had been washed away, and made a great hollow underneath, which held up the cliff as long as it could, and then gave way all at once." "You're talking as if a torrent ran down from the top of the cliff yonder." "Just so," said Griggs. "Then where did it go to?" said Chris. "That's what we've got to find out. Got a hole of its own underground perhaps, and dives down, to come up again miles away perhaps, and water it is!" "Where?" cried Chris excitedly, and he threw up his head, his nostrils expanded, and he sniffed loudly. Griggs threw up his head too, but he did not open his nostrils and sniff loudly. He only laughed. "More ways of killing a cat than hanging it," he cried merrily. "Other ways besides seeing and smelling. Hark!" They had pushed their way in among the outer blocks that had bounded farthest, and their ponies had halted at the bottom of the slope because they could go no farther without attempting to climb. "Hark! What to? What at? I can't hear anything." "Yes, I can," cried the boy excitedly. "It's a singing, gurgling noise. Why, Griggs, you're right. There's water running down below here." "Well done, Hearing," cried Griggs. "I'll be bound to say there's a big natural tunnel down below here. 1 minute. Let's try a bit more to the right." They dismounted, and Griggs led the way, brushing the rocks about with his pole as he climbed up and up, listening the while, for about 60 or 70 yards, and then he stopped short, picked up a stone about as big as his head, and pitched it away forward. There was silence for a few moments, and then, just as Chris climbed up alongside and found himself on the edge of a deep chasm going down into gloom, he heard a hollow, echoing splash. "Sounds like water," said Griggs coolly, "and plenty of it." "Yes," cried Chris as he listened. "Why, I heard that dull rumbling sound before," he continued as he bent over, "but it seemed to come from high up in the cliffs, and I thought it was the wind." "So did I," said Griggs. "I suppose the sound comes up and strikes against the rock face, to be reflected off to where we could hear it down below." "Would it be?" "To be sure, my lad. Sounds just like light in that, It strikes against anything and goes off, they say, at the same angle, and then perhaps it's only in one position that you can see it. Same here. There's one part down below where we can catch this rumbling, hissing echo." "But you don't call that finding water? What a horrible place! How are we to get at it?" "Oh, easily enough," said Griggs coolly. "You'll have to go down with all the bottles and fill them." "What? Down there?" "Yes. Shouldn't you like the job?" "Of course not." "Well, then, I must," said Griggs, laughing. "No, that wouldn't be fair." "Never mind, we'll argue that out afterwards," said Griggs merrily. "Anyhow, we've found what we wanted." Clapping his hands to the sides of his mouth, he shouted, "Water!" and the rest of the party began to move towards them, delighted with the news. "Any snakes about?" cried the doctor as they reached the foot of the slope. "Haven't seen any up here," was the reply, and the party climbed up to stand at the edge of the great pit-like place, gazing down and listening to the hollow, echoing roar of what was evidently a large body of water. "Well done!" cried the doctor. "Why, there must be quite a tunnel below here." "I think not, sir. It's only a narrow path in the side of the place, partly filled up with the big stones fallen from above, but there's evidently a great well-like place going right down ever so deep to flow underground." "But how are we to get at the water now we have found it?" said Wilton. "I for one am not going down there." "It ought to be some one light and active, not a big strong man," said Griggs dryly. "Perhaps Mr. Ned here wouldn't mind." Ned's face underwent such a change, becoming contracted in so absurd a manner, that Chris burst into a roar of laughter and began to stamp about. "Oh yes, it's very funny," cried Ned, in an ill-used tone. "Perhaps Chris would like the job." "Not I," cried the boy. "Nobody could go down there." "I'm afraid not," said the doctor, peering down and listening to the deep hollow roar. "And we've had all our trouble for nothing." "Oh no, sir," said Griggs. "The hole doesn't go straight down. We're all thirsty, and it would be a long job to go all the way back to that fall. We'd better give the animals what we have in the tubs, and I'll go down with one and fill it again." "No, no, we must go back." "Before we've explored this place, sir? Why, as likely as not, we shall find it is another gold city when we come to search. I'll go down." "It is too risky, man. Suppose you slipped?" "Ah, that would be awkward, and you'd have to go miles away to look for the hole where I came out," said Griggs, laughing. "But I'm not going to run any risks of that sort. I've too much liking for old Griggs, as young Chris here calls me. Oh, it's easy enough, sir. I'll take down one of the barrels with some of the lariats knotted together, and one end made fast round my chest. Then if I slip you can haul me up." "I hardly like letting you go," said the doctor, speaking dubiously. "It'll be easy enough," said the American coolly. "I'll do it." They went back to where the mules were grazing, distributed the contents of one barrel amongst them, and then brought the empty vessel up to the edge of the gap, where Griggs set busily to work knotting the hide ropes they had with them tightly together, after which a bundle of dry pine boughs was lit, after being bound together with a bit of chain attached to the end of the lariats. The wood was soon blazing brightly, and it was then lowered down, to keep on touching at the side of what proved to be a sharp slope, but only to be shaken clear again and go on lighting up the sloping, cave-like place, till, as the watchers peered down, they suddenly caught sight of the reflection of the ruddy, smoky light, and upon the blazing faggot descending another few feet, after lodging once more, they could see the rushing water tearing along, to pass right beneath where the observers stood. By this time the faggot was burning rapidly away, and fiery brands began to drop, to fall with a hiss into the underground torrent, some to become extinct on the moment, while others glided out of sight on the surface, giving a good idea of the extent of the place. "There," said Griggs coolly. "It's all right, you see, sir. We'll have 2 ropes, one for the barrels and one for a lifeline. I shall take one of the lanthorns down with me. Say, young Chris, I hope we shan't have made the water taste of burnt wood and turpentine." "There's no fear of that," said the doctor. "All that water will be far away before you reach the surface. Are you making those knots sure?" "You may trust me, sir," said Griggs coolly enough. "Why, what a fuss we're making about going 20 feet down at the end of a rope. I believe I could keep down those stones easy enough without. May as well have a line round me, though, I suppose." "You'll not go down without," said the doctor decisively. The preparations did not take long. "Only long enough to make us more thirsty," Griggs said, and then of the two lines made ready, one was attached to the barrel carefully and well, the other made fast about the American's chest. "I don't like for him to go down," said Chris aside to his companion. "I don't either," replied Ned. "It seems so unfair when I'm so much lighter," continued Chris excitedly, "and as if I ought to go." Then on the impulse of the moment, "Here, father, I'll go down instead." "Shame!" cried Griggs merrily. "Do you want to rob a poor fellow of having the first drink? No, thank you. This is my job, and I won't give it up to anyone. Now then, we're all ready, I think." "What about the lanthorn?" cried Bourne. "I won't have it, thank you, sir," said Griggs. "It'll only be in the way, and I shan't want it. Looks dark down there, but it'll be light enough when I get below for all that I've got to do." "But it looks horribly dark," whispered Chris, who stood close to Griggs. "Yes, from here, because you're looking into a dark hole. When I'm down there I shall be able to look up here at the sunshine." "Light the lanthorn, boys, and tie it to the end of a couple of the ropes. We have plenty, have we not?" "Oh yes, plenty," said Wilton, and in a very short time the light was ready in case of an emergency. "Now then," said Griggs, "I dare say I shall be able to climb up again after I've done, but if I can't, I suppose two will be strong enough to haul me up." "We can have three if necessary," said Bourne excitedly, for he looked the most nervous of anyone present. "Lower down the barrel then, my lads. You can do that," said Griggs. "Just let it touch the water. You'll know when it does, for there will be a tug to sweep it away, but don't let it go. Haul it up a few feet then, and be ready to lower it again when I shout." "Yes," was the reply in a husky whisper, and directly after the barrel was following the course previously taken by the burning faggot, but without catching, its shape allowing it to pass down the steep slope till the expected jerk was given as it kissed the water, when it was snatched back out of the current's reach. "That's all right then," said Griggs cheerily. "Now look here, I shall want you to lower it again so that I can press the bunghole under water. Most likely I shall have to do this with my foot, because my hands will be wanted for holding on. You understand?" "Oh yes, we see," cried Chris. "Then down I go," said Griggs. "Stop!" cried the doctor, and his companions drew a deep breath which sounded as if they were greatly relieved. "What's the matter? Knots loose?" "No, but I don't see that it's necessary for you to go down. We'll let the barrel go into the water, and it will fill itself." "Not it," said Griggs. "It will only be battered to pieces against the rocks there." "I don't know," said the doctor. "We'll try. I don't think we ought to let you go down save as a last resource." "Very well then," cried Griggs. "Suppose you try." The doctor had already joined the boys at the rope, and helped to lower the barrel down to the surface once again, to be, as it were, literally seized by the current, and as those above held on there was a strange, hollow, echoing noise as it was banged from side to side for a minute or two, before Griggs cried, "That'll do. If there's much more of that all the hoops will be torn off. Haul up a bit. You see I must go, sir." The barrel was raised a little once more, and as soon as this was done Griggs turned to Wilton and Bourne, who held the rope fastened about his breast. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," was the reply. "Keep it just tight enough to feel me, but not enough to hinder me as I get down from stone to stone. I don't mean to if I can help it, but be prepared for a slip." The next minute they could see their companion descending from block to block, his form growing fainter each few seconds, during which he made no strain upon the rope, which was steadily drawn through the holder's hands, the doctor having stepped behind the others to form a third, while Chris and Ned lay down upon their chests so as to watch the brave fellow's descent. "All easy going," said Griggs, his voice coming up out of the gloom and sounding hollow and strange. The rope glided down, and a strange, harsh, rasping sound was made as the adventurer lowered himself from stone to stone till he must have been half-way down, when all at once there was a violent tug at the rope, a crash as of something giving way, and directly after a deep echoing roar as of a heavy body plunging into deep water far below. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of the Peril Finders by George Fenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sarah Hannah, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The Olden Folk. "Pull! Pull! Pull!" cried Chris wildly. "No, no," came from below. "I'm all right. Only a big stone I loosened. Wait a moment, and then let me go on." Chris uttered a hoarse gasp and turned faint, while Ned felt the hide rope attached to the barrel turn wet and slippery in his hands. "Go on! Gently!" cried Griggs, and the rope was once more allowed to glide steadily down. The rasping of boots on the blocks of stone below continued, and at the end of another minute ceased as Griggs shouted up. "There, I'm all right. Standing on a big block, with the water rushing along about a foot below me. Keep tight hold now. You boys, ease down the barrel till I shout. Don't let it go when the water grabs it. Lower away. Right! I have it. Now ease a little more and a little more. Now keep tight. I'm going to force it under water." It seemed to Chris that he could see everything quite plainly as their hands which held the hide ropes were drawn lower and lower. "That's right," came up in Griggs' hoarse, echoing voice, which sounded as if he were panting from the way in which he was exerting himself. And then, with the barrel rope jerking violently, the boys felt a peculiar thrill and a sensation as if the weight was increasing for what seemed, though only a few minutes, a terribly long time. "All right," at last. "She's full. Now then, haul up. I'm safe here, on good standing ground. To hold my rope, up with the barrel." Those at the surface needed no second order, but began to haul away, Chris's hands now growing wet as a horrible thought made him more nervous. And that thought was, what would be the consequence if the rope broke or the barrel slipped from its fastenings? He shuddered again and again at the idea. As with Bourne now helping, the barrel was drawn higher and higher, and then all at once was checked by catching against some projection. "Lower it a little," whispered Chris huskily, and the weight was allowed to descend a few inches, being in the gloom as it went down. "Up now," cried Chris again, and the next moments were exciting in the extreme, as he anticipated another check when the projection was reached. But Chris's gasp turned into a faint hurrah as the barrel hoops scraped over the projection, and it came up now hand over hand till it reached the surface. It was drawn right away to stand amongst the loose stones. "Got it?" came from below. "Yes," cried the doctor. "All right. Can you climb up?" There was no answer for some seconds, and then the American said in a peculiarly husky voice, "Coming up. Haul steady." 3 pairs of hands were at the rope now, and their owners exchanged glances as they kept up a steady strain, feeling that Griggs was trying to climb, but jerking the line again and again as if his efforts resulted in a series of slips. After the last, the adventurers' efforts seemed to be so feeble that the haulers kept on steadily gathering in the rope hand over hand, till Griggs's hands came within reach, when Chris and Ned each seized one to give the final tug which drew him over the edge of the hole, and right away to a level spot, where he sank down, apparently quite exhausted, and with a peculiarly strained look about his eyes. "Feel overdone?" said the doctor. "A little, sir," was the faint reply. "Can you give me a drop of water?" This was quickly obtained, and the poor fellow swallowed it with difficulty, and then seemed to revive a little, while the doctor, who looked anxious, held one of his hands. "Better now," panted Griggs. "That's beautiful water, cold and sweet, but I should have to be very bad before I dared go down to get any more. I didn't know I was such a cur." "I felt that it was too much for a man to do, Griggs," said the doctor quietly. "So did I, sir," was the feeble reply, "but it had to be done, and I thought I could make a better finish out of the job. I say, nice example to set you two lads. This made me feel weak as a rat. Ugh! It was very horrid when that stone gave away. I thought I was gone." "It was horrible," said the doctor. "There, you succeeded. Now don't think any more about it." "Can't help it, sir. I feel as if I must. I say I hope that the people who lived here didn't all disappear down that hole and never come up again." "It has quite unnerved you, Griggs," said the doctor kindly. "I don't know about that, sir, but it has made me feel that I daren't go down that place again, even if it was to save my life. There, I'm sorry I made such an exhibition of myself. I did try to be plucky, but that place below there, with the water trying to sweep you off into the black darkness, and the end was too much for me. I believe I nearly lost my senses once." "Well," he cried half fiercely after a short pause, during which he looked keenly at first one and then the other of the boys, "you've both got a good laugh of me this time. Did you ever see such a coward before?" "Come along down below there and see about a fire and a meal," said the doctor quietly. "Let it go now, Griggs. You didn't feel more nervous than I did. I was worse, I believe, for I feel guilty as well for letting you go down. There, I don't think we shall want to get our water from that place again." "Why not?" said Ned suddenly. "We could get some up with a bucket if there was a heavy stone in the bottom. It would only mean half a bucketful at a time, but there's no reason why we couldn't do that." Everyone glared at the speaker as if wroth with him for proposing so simple and self-evident a means of getting at the water at a time when they had only succeeded at the risk of losing a valuable life. But no one spoke, all preparing to descend the slope at the bottom of which the barrel was slung and carried between Wilton and Bourne to the spot chosen for their camp. Here a good fire was soon made, dead wood being plentiful, and over the evening meal, hastily prepared, the incident of the afternoon was gravely discussed, Griggs joining in calmly enough now, for he seemed to have quite recovered his nerve. "You'll have a good examination made of this place in the morning, sir?" he said. "I was thinking of moving off," said the doctor quietly, "and getting to somewhere better suited for a temporary camp." "You couldn't get a better place than this, doctor," said Griggs quietly. "I've been thinking over what young Ned here said about dipping out water, and he's quite right. Don't think of going until the place has been thoroughly searched. I'm quite right now." "Very well," said the doctor. "We'll have another day, at all events, but I do not anticipate making much of a find here." "I don't know, sir," said Griggs gravely. "We're getting into the gold country now, and such a place as this wouldn't have been made for nothing, nor be the living camp of a few poor wandering Indians. I shouldn't be a bit surprised to find traces of mining with furnaces and crucibles for melting the gold somewhere through these openings. They were evidently a big race of people who lived up here." "We shall find that out tomorrow," said the doctor. "But what about keeping watch? Do you think there's any danger of Indians tracing us here?" "Not a bit, sir," replied the American. "They don't care much for these rocky parts. They like the plains, where their horses feel at home." "But there must have been a big tribe here." "No, sir. Not of Indians such as rove the plains. There must have been a different kind of people, miners and builders. Your regular Red Indian thinks of nothing but his horse, his hunting, and a fight with his enemies so as to get plunder. The people who mined for gold were a different kind of folk altogether." "Well, we shall see tomorrow," said the doctor. "There are sure to be some traces of them in their old homes." "I don't care what they were or what they did," said Chris that night, as they laid down to sleep in the dark bottom of the depression, gazing up at the great lustrous stars. "But I don't want any more water got like that. Ugh! It almost had a nasty taste when it was made into tea. Didn't you notice it?" he said after a pause, but there was no reply. "I say, didn't you notice that the water seemed to taste nasty?"